And we are now live. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this week. This is Raising Multilinguals Live. My name is Tetsu Young from Ask Tetsu. And I have my colleague Ute in a different area today. Let us know where you are, Ute. Ute? Hello?
Yes,
Are you hearing me?
hello, my name is Ute Ribot from Ute's International Lounge, and I'm in the north of the Netherlands.
Fantastic.
Hello?
Yeah, we hear
I
you.
hear you.
It seems like there's a lag. We're like on those news programs. We're like, hello? And then you hear for like 5 seconds before the reporter answers. So we also have, of course, a very, very special guest today. We have Dr. Carlos Yebra López. So Carlos, I've been following Carlos for a little while now on Twitter and his YouTube channel. It's a very, very informative channel, and we'll definitely let Carlos tell us more about what he does in his life. But I have a little introduction here. I know that Carlos holds a PhD in Spanish and Portuguese languages and literature from the New York University. So he stayed in the U.S. for a little while, but he is currently a research fellow on Ladino at the University College London. So he also is a founder, and he's the founder and CEO of the Hyperpolyglot activist, and he will clearly tell us a little bit more about that. So, Carlos, welcome to Raising Multilinguals Live. Thank you for sparing some time out of your hectic schedule. Carlos and I just met end of last month in Mexico. We were in Mexico for the Polyglot conference, so that's where I met Carlos for the first time in real life. Carlos, first questions we always like to ask our interviewee is to introduce him or herself, a little bit of his background, what he does in his activities surrounding languages. So please tell us about why you wanted to become a language expert and what you do.
Thank you, Tetsu. Thank you, Ute, for welcoming me into this program. It was a pleasure to meet you in the Polyglot Conference 2022 in Cholula, Mexico, and I knew we would get along really well, so thank you so much. Now, the first answer then is that I did not originally start with languages in mind. I started my BA in philosophy, and within philosophy, I specialized in the philosophy of language. So I was interested in analyzing language from a critical perspective, and then languages was something auxiliary. So I would study English and German in the morning, and in the evenings I will have my philosophy classes. And as I continued to learn languages, I realized more and more that what started being a means to an end, a means to the end of philosophy, became little by little almost just an end in itself. I enjoyed learning languages so much that in the end, I enjoyed even more than the reason for which I was studying them, which was to develop my philosophy. And I say almost because I never quite lost that critical edge on languages. So ever since then, even though I transitioned into the language learning world, I still kept my critical perspective, which I think makes me different than many other polyglots in the world right now.
I see. So today, we invited you to talk. We know your expertise is mostly on languages and adult language learners, but you also have this little side gig, I think, comparing sort of how it differs at learning as an adult versus learning as children. So let's start with you. You learned languages later, I guess, more as an adult. How would you say is if you compare adults and children, just a wide question right now, just to get things kicked off, how would you describe sort of the difference between kids and adults?
Yes, so I come from a monolingual family, and so that's something that makes me quite rare within the polyglot community. And I would agree with you that I'm a sort of a late bloomer when it comes to learning languages. But still, I had some marginal contact with international languages growing up as a kid. Those two were due to my geographical location. I'm originally from Zaragoza in the north of Spain, so that's close to Catalonia, hence Catalan. And obviously, Spain is next to Portugal. So those were the main linguistic influences that I had as a kid. And based on my experience, interacting with other languages as a kid is something much more visceral than doing so as an adult. So
Visceral. I like that word.
Yes.
I like that word.
Whether it is for good or for worse, for good or for bad, for better or worse, it's visceral in the sense that it is a feeling, a sensation that you develop that is mediated by reason and logics. So I'll give you an example. In Aragon, which is the autonomous community to which Zaragoza belongs, we watched Dragon Ball in Catalan originally. And because my semantic association of Catalan was with something that I already loved, I had a positive memory of Catalan as a language. Whereas my first contact with Portuguese was through a trivia game that was very difficult. And having those questions in Portuguese contributed to how abstruse were some of them. And so my semantic association with Portuguese was negative. And in both cases, it was very strong. So that's what I remember the most in terms of learning languages as a kid. And I will assume by analogy that all the kids might experience similar reaction vis-a-vis languages, which means that both teaching and learning languages as a kid is always risky in some sense. Now, this doesn't mean it's necessarily a gamble, right? We can adopt calculated risks, but there's a risk and reward implicit there. Yeah.
I see. But now you say you would describe the kids' learning experience as a visceral experience. So as opposed to if you were an adult, it's more of a rational, calculated.
Yes, I think that. See, one of the reasons why people struggle to understand how is it to learn languages as a kid vis-a-vis adults is that they ask questions that cannot be answered in their own terms. And so the most popular question is, which one is the better learner, right? Adults or kids? Well, this is still a matter of contention for the very simple reason that it cannot be meaningfully answered in its own terms. Because the answer is kids tend to be better in some aspects and worse in others. And one of those aspects where there's a clear difference between kids and adults is neurologically. Right? So on the one hand, we do have this critical period according to the critical period hypothesis, according to which between the ages of, say, 4 and 17.4, as per Pinker's famous article in 2018, there is a critical period where the kid can learn very fast, particularly concerning phonology. And once that period is over, it's going to be very difficult, almost impossible to adopt the accent of a regular L1 speaker in that language, for instance, right? So that's an advantage for kids, phonologically, pronunciation-wise. But then you have exactly what you said, that logical perspective, rational perspective that adults are capable of in a much more accentuated degree than kids. And so pattern recognition, for instance, and rule deduction, these are very important aspects when it comes to learning languages quickly. And that's why the more languages you know, the easier it becomes, because those patterns are already second nature, internalized, right? And there, adults have an advantage, as they have also when it comes to mechanics, spelling, punctuation, because of the experience that they have accumulated, right? So again, these are tendencies. You might come up with the example of a kid that is 4 years old and whose punctuation is spotless, but that doesn't disprove the general tendency, right?
Absolutely. The exceptions don't make the rule. Well, I think we lost Uta. she's in a different location, so we're gonna have to excuse her for a few minutes as we carry on with this fascinating discussion. It just appears to me there's no end to it, which I think is a good thing. People want to make things black or white, but I don't think that's how we absolutely need to go. It depends. Is a very very good answer. Let me bring Ute back in. Welcome back, Ute. I don't know if she hears us clearly, but anyways, we were still on the discussion of comparing adult learners
I don't
versus.
know if you hear me.
Yes, we hear you. I wonder if you hear us, but everything's good. So let's continue this discussion. Comparing, I want to dig a little more deeper into this.
Absolutely.
Because which is better? It's not always which is better, but you can put parameters and then sort of say which is better. It's like, do you want a Porsche or a Honda? If you just say, do you want a Porsche or a Honda? Obviously I want a Porsche, but if you put in the price into it or your efforts, your resources, then the answer can depend, right?
You're touching up on something that is really important, which are expectations and priorities. And so a related question that people ask a lot to me, but also to you, I guess, is what is the ideal age for a kid to start learning languages? And then again, the question cannot be answered in such coarse-grained terms. You need to be more specific, right?
That's right.
And one of the things that we need to consider is, what do you expect or would like your kid to have when it comes to multilingual skills, right? Are multilingual skills part and parcel of their identity, or are more like an extracurricular activity, the icing on the cake, to an otherwise more well-rounded personality? Depending on your answer, you're going to start initiating your kid in language learning before, if it's something you assimilate, you think it's structural or should be or could be structural in their personality, then you better start early. Or if you don't think that is the case and you're thinking about language learning more in terms of democratic values, tolerance, something that completes the person rather than makes the person, then perhaps you can start at a later stage, right?
Well, that's a fantastic answer. I mean, you've opened kind of a big can of, not worms, but something nice. I don't like to say worms for this.
Candies, a can of candies.
It is a good, a very, specific question that we always talk to our parents asking us these questions. When is the best time to start, etc. And this prerequisite, this way of thinking, it must come before. You have to first figure out what is your end goal. And we advocate, go as early as possible, but there's always the assumption that you have as much effort and resources as required to do whatever you want. But if you don't, if it is limited, if money is limited, if time is limited, and your expectations are not like a must-have, if it's just a nice-to-have or something that complements, like you mentioned earlier, this child's future life, then by all means delay the start. And we had a very, very interesting talk in our last session with Professor Ojima from Japan, and he talked to us about the critical period hypothesis a little more in depth. And his comparison to children and adults is like the race, the hare against the turtle. Okay, adults actually learn faster in a unit of time, but the ultimate attainment for languages is actually better for children. So the earlier you start, the better you have a chance to attain a higher level of mastery of that language, predicate on giving the child massive exposure. So if you have the resources to do that, and if you really, really want the child to learn this language as like a native or a near native level, then yes, we definitely advise that you go as early as possible.
I'll have two comments on this. I think you're touching upon something that is fundamental here, the category of resources, and that in turn touches upon socioeconomic status. So we talked about cognitive differences, right? But let's talk about socioeconomic status. I don't know if you have come across this meme, which is, what is something really, really cool when you're rich, but something that doesn't matter as much when you're poor? And it's learning languages as a kid.
Uh-huh.
You know, when the son or the daughter of famous
I
prince,
see.
queen, blah blah blah, speaks two languages, everybody
Yeah.
loses it. It's like,
Yeah,
wow,
yeah, I saw that. Yes.
because it's royal blood. But if their parents are poor, it doesn't matter if that person speaks 6 languages. It's just not as cool, right? So status definitely matters. Another thing is inhibition vis-a-vis self-sabotage. For instance, adults are more self-conscious, right? We spoke about be more rational, more logical, but part of consciousness is self-consciousness. So if you are too self-conscious, then you also put yourself in a position to be much more inhibited when it comes to social interactions and to incur self-sabotage or self-censorship, because you don't want to come across in this way or this other way, whereas kids don't really have second thoughts about that, or not as much, right? So that's also important, and that's why when it comes to adult schools, there are, like, for instance, techniques to circumvent this. One is alcohol, right? You throw a language mixture with alcohol, and after a couple of beers, you're just more de-inhibited. It is what it is, right? Everybody will attest to that. Another one, perhaps more subtle, is the adoption of theater. So in some language schools, for instance, let's suppose we're in a French language school. Now your name is no longer Tetsu, it's Francois. So if you make a mistake, it follows that Tetsu never made a mistake, only Francois, right? So that allows you to detach your ego from mistakes and be less afraid of making mistakes, and therefore more de-inhibited, right?
Wow.
That's also
indeed. This reminds me of the interview that we did with Stephen Krashen earlier this year. Right? The first one we did this year with Stephen Krashen, and he gave the example of a student who was learning French, but he just hated the language. He just despised the course, and so they had this this oral presentation at the end of the course to pass the course, and he hated it so much that he decided he was just going to ridicule the professors in front of him and exaggerate all the accents and the sort of the mannerism of the French, you know, du vin, and he was just really exaggerated everything, and in his mind he was like sort of laughing at the French culture, but he got a fantastic grade because he came up with excellent accent, and so and his observations were really spot on. It's sort of stereotypical, but at the same time it's something that was spot on, and that was Stephen Krashen's sort of example that even as adults we actually do have the capacity to learn accents to a very good level. It's just that we have this inhibition within us, and that we sort of feel sort of ridiculous if we make a very good accent.
Indeed. And there is no denying that the neuroplasticity is superior in that during that critical age. But I think it's also important to qualify the statement that there is such a thing as a native level. I think that learning a language as your first one, right, what we call in critical linguistics L1 speaker, does not necessarily amount to this idealization that we have in our head that is a native speaker, right, which we imagine as the infallible model of language competence that we all aspire to or want to participate from, right? And that we're somehow divine from it, right? Fell from grace, from the grace of nativeness, right? And I think that well, this is empirically false, because most L1 speakers don't have a C2 level, for instance. So if we try to equate native level with the utmost level of proficiency, that fails. That's simply not true. And it's not true because, as we were saying, you know, languages are not biological entities, but socio-cultural constructs, our mastery of which ebbs and flows through our lifetime. And therefore, a stronger predictor of a C2 level is the level of education of that person in question. So, for instance, I have a C2 in English. I didn't start to learn a word of English until I was 10 years old, right? And why do I have this level and other person doesn't have the C2 that spoke this language since age 3? It has to do with education, right? I'm not saying that having a C2 level or it's infallible, or that proficiency can be measured as the C2 level pretends it can be measured, right? It can't.
Mhm.
And there's much more to a language than C2 level. When you reach the C2 level, you realize there should be C3, C4, C5. Right? But anyway, yeah.
But in the end, I think all these qualifications per se is for the adult world.
Yeah.
You know, whether it's for career or for sort of your self satisfaction of getting achieving a specific goal. It's not a child doesn't care.
Right. But at the same time, there is, I think, in school a strong incentive to credentialize language learning and to measure it in some way. Yeah, maybe you don't have a certificate per se, but you have stars, right? I remember when I was learning English as a kid, we always had the stars, and the competition was fierce for those stars.
Oh, really?
They were golden, right? So you can put it here. So you have 3 stars, and you're like the general commander of the army of language learners. So yeah.
Wow. Well, at least you had fun learning English.
Definitely,
yeah. It's some people learn it because they have to, and they sort of feel forced into it, and that's it's a tough act.
Yes. That's why typically in the language learning field we distinguish between multilinguals, and polyglots. So multilinguals are those who learn it as part of their upbringing, which does not necessarily mean they enjoy it. They may or may not enjoy it.
Yeah.
Whereas polyglots are more like conscious, self-taught language learners that systematically, meticulously, consciously go after that language learning process. Yeah.
So already by separating people, from multilinguals, polyglots, and even monolinguals are just like normal people, it's already impossible for us to sort of compare whether adults are better language learners than kids, because there are different types of adults: those who love languages, those who want to learn languages, and those who, I guess, are better apt at learning languages just due to their academic, I guess, prowess. Some people are better at learning or studying. Some people are not.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is very important. So 2 things on this. First, the idea that monolinguals are normal, right, or are they by default category. This actually comes from the internalization of a linguistic ideology of monolingualism, which is tied to European colonialism and all of that. But when it comes to the raw data, most people in the world are not monolingual. So monolingualism, from a statistic perspective, right, is the exception to the rule.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, we have internalized that as the norm, right? So, but it's not a statistical norm; it's an ideological norm, more in the Foucauldian sense, yeah. And then I forgot my second comment because I got too pedantic. Yes, the intellectual, the intellectual aspect, yeah.
All right.
And yeah, I wanted to say that in Babel No More, Michael Erhardt makes this wonderful comment, and he says, because a question that he came across a lot was, are polyglots born or made, right? And he said they are born to be made. So yes, there are genetic predispositions.
Okay.
Then the copious amount of hours and hours of study and repetition comes in, right? So yeah, for instance, to me, I was always studious in the school, but I was never particularly talented for languages. It wasn't like I had a 7 out of 10 in most subjects and then I had a 10 out of 10 in English. Never the case. If anything, it was kind of the opposite.
Okay.
So I just got good at learning languages by repetitions and insistence, to be honest, more than anything.
Wow. Okay. Now let's take a little breather and say hello to everybody who's watching us right now on YouTube, Facebook, and on Twitter. So thank you for joining in. We forgot a few comments already, so we're just gonna run those by quickly. Earlier we were talking about the question of whether kids or adults are better, etc. And Heather says the answer is always it depends. So I'm glad that people sort of accept that. It's also something that when I was doing my MBA, we would all get frustrated when the teacher says, well, it depends. Yeah. So in language learning, I guess it's also the same thing. It depends. And this was also in reference to talking about goals, right? What is your ultimate goal in raising multilingual kids? Do you want it to be an integral part of his or her life as a must-have, or something that's complementary, like something that boosts career opportunities later in life? So it depends. And the resources, right? It depends. And then we have Uta. Uta says, sorry, my connection is terrible. So she is still participating and asking her questions offline, or she's online, but not within the virtual studio with us, but she is there. She is there with us. And earlier we were talking about inhibitions, right? Adults have more inhibitions, more conscious about making mistakes. So making a fun factor is important. And we were talking about the difference between polyglots and multilinguals. And
yes.
somebody like myself, I've learned languages later in life, but I grew up with a few languages already. So I'm actually both.
I kind of compare it to killing. You know, you can kill somebody on accident, or you can be a serial killer. So if you're a serial killer, it's different from killing somebody on accident, right? But then again, jokes aside, learning a language is very rarely a question of an accident, right? It's just that you don't know yourself, the learner, about the causes. But the people who place you in that institution or in that course certainly know, right? So
indeed. And again, the difference between adults is that and kids is that adults are more systematic language. Okay,
yes,
well, thank you so much. We've sort of went around. I've branched off quite a lot from the questions we had prepared in advance, but that's how it usually is, and that's how interesting discussions go. And we may not go through all the questions we have, and that's also fine. And I think we've already touched upon this a little bit earlier, but let's formalize it. Parents ask us all the time. It's like, when should I start? Right? We advocate for as early as possible. Once again, we have to come back to our presupposition that you have not infinite, but you have as much resources as you want, or you're putting as much resources as you can. What's your answer? What's the best time?
Right. So we said that it depends on the priorities and what you're looking for and what the kid is looking for, which is also interesting, right?
We didn't touch upon that yet. That's right. What does the kid want?
But then we also said that if you're aiming for phonetics and pronunciation, the earlier the better. If you see this as something that complements, that makes a well-rounded individual more competent in speaking languages, then that can be at a later stage. It's not the age is not as critical. But I want to add something new to this.
Yes.
Which is, I don't have kids myself.
Okay.
So I cannot answer the question, but I can ask it. Yeah. I know from experience that some people have a recipe for when kids should start learning languages for the kids of other people, but then they have a different policy for their own kids.
Okay.
Right? So I think that the connection to those kids, the personal rapport to those kids is also important when it comes to answering these questions. Let me give you an example, and then I'll ask about your own experience.
Sure.
So I work with Ladino or Judeo-Spanish, right? It's a very endangered language. There are a lot of activists in the world that say, oh, we need to teach this to our kids, because intergenerational transmission is very important, blah, blah, blah. But when these people themselves had kids, they did not teach this language to their kids. Not as the first language, not as the second one, the third, or any other language. Why? Because they were worried that they will be made fun of at school, for instance, or not as or not integrated in their new country, or not as popular.
I see.
So, in your experience, are there factors that you change based on whether the kid is, say, maybe not, doesn't even need to be your own kid, but the kid of your sister or somebody close enough that it will make you change your perspective?
Your example is something that comes up quite a lot with, let's say, mainstream languages. So that does come up quite a bit. in our case, we do English, French, Japanese, Mandarin, and Spanish, all of which are basically mainstream languages. So, but hypothetically, something that could change could be, let's say we live in Quebec, so we do French, but the French here in Quebec has a very distinctive accent. And if we were to move to France, obviously what we would probably do is to adopt the French, just because if it's a permanent move, right? That's to fit in, and that's maybe because I am an immigrant here, so I don't have that visceral, I like that word, visceral attachment to the language as if I were to be raised here. But somebody who's a Quebecer family, completely Quebecer, who relocates to France, may have a different approach. They may want to keep the French, the Quebecer French. That's something that could be a difference in strategy. Whereas I'm from Taiwan originally. The Mandarin that we speak here is the Taiwanese Mandarin. I wouldn't try to teach them or get them to learn the Chinese version of the Mandarin. So there's a root in me that's Taiwanese. So you see, that's something I would consider to be important in the strategy, in the choices of the language, I think.
Right. So the extent to which languages are defining of your identity.
Indeed. And we go to Taiwan as much as possible. Lately, lately due to COVID, we couldn't go, but usually every year we'd go for a few months and get the kids to live the language and to feel that it's part of their life, the relevance, to boost the relevance of the language. And that allows them to feel pride, I think, associate that with the language. And so far, so good. Knock on wood. When I'm outside, I try to be careful when I'm with my kids to not talk to them really loudly or shout at them across the room in Mandarin, because it attracts a lot of attention since we're in Quebec. But I realized that my kids are not so sensitive, and they would talk to me really loud from the other side of the room in Mandarin. And so far so good in that sense. But I do try to be sure that I'm not sort of putting them on in the spotlight negatively.
Right.
All right. We have another comment from Uta saying this has to do with language ideology. So the language ideology within the micro-society, the family, should always be that that the languages needed in the family are fostered. Yeah, indeed. So, yeah, what you were saying earlier with Ladino, how do the speakers make the language relevant? I think it's a big barrier. It's a big burden, I think, in the minority language.
Because it's a diasporic language and communities are scattered all across the globe and they no longer live together after the Holocaust for obvious reasons, then safe spaces, right? Ladino-only spaces have to be created ex professo to foster that situation artificially.
Yes.
Which means that, to Uta's point, that language is not needed, strictly speaking, in a utilitarian understanding of the term, but they're needed maybe emotionally, right? When it comes to preserving heritage, transmitting it to the next generation. So yeah, needed is a complicated term. Yeah.
But once again, needed emotionally for who? Right? For the adults, definitely. But for the kids, how do you make it emotionally relevant to the children? That's an important point to focus on.
Yeah, and those adults go sometimes. Those adults go sometimes later on in their life to, quote unquote, rediscover their roots. Maybe they took a My Heritage or My Tree, whatever, DNA test, and then they discover, oh, you're 10% Sephardic, and then they want to learn the language themselves again consciously, right, as adults.
Yes. Sorry, I was back and forth. Now I'm back, but thank you for answering this question. It has also to do with the agency of the children, right? How much they have to say in all this, and the older they get, the more usually they have a say about which language to adopt also. And there are some negotiations with the parents as well. So it's a long story. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, we have a comment from Yoshito, and this goes back a little bit to what we were talking about, how you would give this, some, advice to other people and their children, whereas what you do with your own children is different. And and he says it's probably because when it comes to our own children, we are emotionally involved. Well, definitely, definitely, we are more afraid of making mistakes. Yeah,
and I think that I think that both being afraid of making mistakes and wanting to teach languages to kids as soon as possible participate from the same anxiety, which is to try to be as good a parent as we can be, right? And sometimes we don't know how to do that exactly. We know we want to be that, but we don't know how to.
We know it when the children are grown up.
Right.
While they are children.
Yeah, and it's this dilemma. You're afraid to miss that window because we're so focused on the critical period.
Yeah.
We feel like it's a trap, right? What if I don't do it within this time frame? What's negative that's going to come out of?
Yeah, but again, we had this discussion the other session, right? That this critical period is changing. It's actually not there in the end. But okay, I missed some part of this discussion.
Yeah, but the key question that parents need to ask themselves from this discussion is, what are your goals? Like, what are your goals and what are your resources? What can you make out of this? And it may not be going as early as possible if you have to choose.
And just to be perhaps even more tragic, I think
don't be tragic.
I think that there is always, regardless of how much number crunching you make and how much you think about all the factors, in the end is a decision for which you don't have enough conclusive evidence. So you have to take a leap of faith, in the words of Kierkegaard. In the end, right, you have to make a decision, and that decision is going to be underdetermined by the factors you need to consider.
Yes, and the decision can also change over time, right? So something that you decided when your children were younger can completely change over 10, 20 years. So it's something.
In the case we just mentioned, this person that I was referring to without saying their name told me, I regret not having taught this endangered language to my kid when I had a chance, but I only understood this retrospectively 30 years later, right?
Yeah, well, if resources are not a factor, then I think our advice would still hold. It's like, just go as early as possible, because you still have a chance to become an adult, but you don't have a chance to go back to becoming a kid. So yeah, if you have time and money, then try to go as early as possible. Not a lot you can lose. I think. Well, we're just going. Nuances.
No, because yes, nuances. It depends again. No, because if, like we said at the beginning, if you really want to learn the language and you have the intention to learn it, and you get all the resources and all the things, and you get organized. There's a nice video of you, Carlos. I saw it earlier, I think from a few days ago, where you say how to structure actually when you want to learn a language online, for example. So if you get at it systematically, you can also learn it when you're adult. And even those children or those adults who say, well, my parents didn't transmit an important language to me, and this is just a shame, and I lost 20 years or 30 or even 40 years. This is, in my opinion, an excuse, because you still have the opportunity to dig in and to really learn it if you want it.
Yes.
No?
On the other hand, I think there is an additional advantage of learning languages as a kid, That doesn't have to do with language competence necessarily, which is the issue of translanguaging, right? So when you learn languages prior to school, you conceptualize them differently.
Yes.
So there are studies on how kids conceptualize their speaking what we call different languages. For instance, French and German, right? French with mom and German with the father.
Mhm.
They don't necessarily conceptualize these languages as self-contained,
Separate.
autonomous, discrete entities, right? They talk about two different situations
Mhm.
in which they use different parts of their linguistic repertoire or ability, right? And I think that this is very good when it comes to fighting prejudices later on in life. Whereas if you start at the same time as school, you inherit the linguistic ideologies that are purported at that particular school.
Mhm.
Right? And later on, it's very, very difficult to de-learn that, right? Because you have it so ingrained that it's really hard to detach yourself from these assumptions that, monolingual is the norm and the rest is the exception, things like that, right?
Mm. Mm.
Mm.
Mm.
It's something like coming up to here, but yeah. So we sort of jumped to this question that we wanted to discuss. So specifically translanguaging. Perhaps you want to define that very quickly for our audience.
Yes.
Between code switching and translanguaging, what's
Right.
the difference
Yes,
there?
exactly. So code switching and the traditional understanding of languages starts with the assumption that languages are separated autonomous entities that can be quantified, right? That's why we ask the question, how many languages do you speak? Implicit within that question is the assumption that languages can be quantified and collected like Pokemons. Translingualism or translanguaging brings that into question and says, well, is this even true? Do everybody geographically and at all stages of life think of languages in this way? And the answer is no. But most people do. Why? Because we have internalized this monolingual language ideology according to which one language corresponds to one nation and one state. That's why we use flags when it comes to language exchange events, for instance, right? That is the idea. But then again, that comes after the fact. Languages do exist as self-discrete, autonomous, self-contained entities. But those are the social-cultural aspects of languages as we have defined them in a certain nation state, environment, etc. Neurologically, biologically, at a brain level, there is no such compartmentalization of modules within the brain in which this part of your brain is just Portuguese, this part is just Spanish, and I just mix them up. Right? So the very idea of code switching presupposes the previous existence of separate codes. Right? And so, translanguaging places the accent on the activity of using language, which is all there is at the beginning. And from that activity of using languages in different contexts, at school, with mom, with dad, with whatever, we then make abstractions and say, okay, this part that you use lexically, grammatically, belongs to German, which the Goethe Institute determines that begins here and ends here. And to the extent to which you participate from the way it should be pronounced and written according to this institute, then you know German or not, right? Yeah. So translanguaging looks at how people use language without watchful adherence for what other people determined are named languages, are German, or English, or French, right? Which has implications for kids, right? It de-stigmatizes, for instance, kids in bilingual schools. Because when you don't have monolingual expectations, you cannot say, hey, don't speak French here. Here we speak English. Hey, this is a mistake. This is not a word that belongs in this class. Right? Because you start from the use of languages without watchful adherence for French, English, etc. So in that case, there is no mistake. There is no language mixing. There is no code switching. There is just using language, the full linguistic repertoire of each person, which is unique and different. That's why it's an idiolect, right? It's idiosyncratic of each person. And that also makes us appreciate language in a different way. Not so much in a pristine, pure way of commanding languages, but as in every people is different, and every people's language ability and skills are unique, not only different but unique. Nobody can reproduce that. That's why the limits of my language are the limits of my world. It doesn't mean the more languages I speak, the broader my world is. It means when I die, that ideolect perishes as well. That's what it means.
All right. Well,
Yes,
let's see how we can make this applicable to education. So I'm sort of bringing in what we just talked about, plus all the stuff that we've discussed today, differences between adults and kids. Everything that we know so far in these differences, how would you make this useful in future education policies or even language teachers? How can we use this knowledge productively?
Yeah, here I don't have a systematic theory, but I do have some intuitions and tips, right?
Yeah.
Which is also interesting. When people say, "Oh, I have language learning tips," it means you don't have a systematic theory of that, which is fine. That's why you ask you for tips, right?
Yeah, of course.
Anyway,
we want your insights.
So, for instance, one thing that I see a lot in language schools is the idea that we ought to learn languages like kids. Because kids they learn it to such a great degree, and they're like sponges and all these things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, adults, if they want to be successful, they should do the same. And I say no, because adults have other strengths, and everybody should play to their strengths. And so it wouldn't make sense, for instance, for language courses for adults to spend so much time with the listening part before speaking, as it does make sense in the case of kids who spend a lot of time listening before speaking, right? For instance. And it will make more sense to make emphasis on, for instance, pattern recognition, differences between the languages that you already master and those you want to learn, which is something we emphasize, for instance, in Ladino. If you already speak Spanish, then we don't have to teach you how to conjugate the verb to have, right? Because that will be a waste of time, etc. Another thing I think is important is time management, because adults have lifestyles and job commitments, etc. It doesn't make sense to not take that into account. So, for instance, late evening classes are very useful for adults, and they don't matter as much for kids, right? In fact, there are some universities that are only evening universities, right, for working class people, for instance. And then also the whole inhibition self-sabotage thing that we spoke about, right? Mm-hmm. Making sure we adopt the inhibition and anti-self-sabotage routines for adults as opposed to kids.
Yeah. If I may add something, because you said before, children spend a lot of time listening, and as adults, if we learn a new language, we shouldn't spend so much time in listening. But the fact is that the little children, they cannot articulate yet all the sounds. So, right. And what they do communicate. We just don't understand them yet. So because they are not articulating in a way that everyone can understand them. But this doesn't mean that they are purely or exclusively listening. They are listening and trying to implement what they hear with sounds from very early on. So
yes, they might be communicating, and they are communicating, but that doesn't mean they're speaking in the sense that we evaluate speaking skills in school, right? Which is why their speaking cannot be decoded by an adult, even though they're speaking.
Yeah. By parents, sometimes they can. They are maybe the only ones that they understand.
Right, or they have like guesses or even different guesses, right? I thought she meant this, or maybe did he mean? I think she meant this. Yeah. But so my point was more so that it will be a mistake for adults to say, okay, let me now adopt that method for myself and try to communicate the same way until everybody can understand the words that I'm trying to say or this other thing.
Yes, because the adult already has a baseline of language knowledge and language proficiency. They can articulate some sounds and make themselves understood, but still there is there is still some kind of trial and error if you do this in the child kind approach, right? Where you,
Right. I mean,
start.
yeah, perhaps the impetus to communicate is something that should be mirrored by adults. You know, the ability to try and tap into as many resources as you can to try and get your point across. Yes.
Yes.
All right, this has been super interesting, and as usual, we have gone over, our target time, which is usually 35-40 minutes, is what we always say we want to aim for, but it's gone over. We're gonna go into sort of wrap-up mode, and I want to know more about the Hyperpolyglot activist, the project that you are spearheading. Tell us about this project, and overall, what do you want to tell us about this?
So it's a community outreach project, right? Which means we're trying to explain what we do at a research level at university in plain terms to as many people as possible. And in particular, we're trying to fill a gap that I think exists, which is the intersection between activism, polyglossia, and linguistics. There are polyglots that are very good qua polyglots, but don't know much about linguistics. There are linguists that are very good qua linguists, but do not necessarily speak many languages. For instance, Chomsky doesn't speak 20 languages, right? Still is one of the most famous linguists. And then there is activism. How do you use those languages to make the world a better place, right? And then vice versa. Activists do not necessarily speak many languages or are experts in linguistics. So we're trying to fill that gap, to contribute to that lacuna between all three domains. And the way we do this is by having your regular polyglot videos of, look at me speaking these languages, or giving tips or systematic approaches on how to learn languages on the internet, right? You can combine this and this and these sources. That is your polyglot side. But then we also have the activist side. For instance, working on Ladino to revitalize that language, which means to revitalize its community of speakers, which I've done since 2017, right? That's an example of how to use languages to make the world a better place. That changes lives for the better. That's the activist side. And then there's the linguistics side / activist, which is to fight social prejudices that are predicated on language. Because nowadays, it is already unfair to discriminate against people on the basis of their social class or the gender or the sexual preferences or this and that. This is typically frowned upon by most of the society. But language somehow still seems fair game. Still seems fair play for people to say, oh, do I hear an accent? Oh, why do you speak with this accent? I mean, no, but really, where are you from? Really? This kind of things, right? This kind of thing. So we're trying to dismantle accentism, which is discrimination of people on the basis of accent.
Yeah.
And the idea that some people have accents and other people don't. Whereas the reality is some people have an accent that is closer to the standard in particular language, others is farther away from that standard, but everybody has an accent because accents are the vehicle of discourse of speaking, so it's inevitable. Speaking without an accent is like typing without a font. Nativespeakerism, right? The idea that yes, people who learn the language as their first language exist, but it's also tied to notions of how you look, the country you come from, where you were born, etc., things that don't necessarily correlate to how you speak a language, to your proficiency in the language, etc. So racial linguistics. So that's the side of linguistics and activism. Yeah, and that's why I think it's necessary, because nobody else, to my knowledge, it's doing this approach in this way.
So your activism is now related to societies or also to families, or would it be okay to have it also within the family settings? I mean, talking about macro society, meso, and micro society.
Right. Yeah, I'm a social linguist, so I look at a macro perspective, absolutely, rather than the micro level. But to me, a family, as you said in the comments, right, it's an institution, and ideology is critical to all institutions. Right? And Foucault and others study how ideologies are reproduced in the institution. So I study family in as much as it participates from linguistic ideologies, although it is not the focus of my research.
Yeah. Okay.
So the hyperpolyglot activist, this is you or you plus a team? Where is it going? Tell us the whole.
Right. Yeah, the Hyperpolyglot activist is just me. I create all the content, I edit all the content, curate all it. I'm the community manager. I do it all. Not necessarily well, but I do it all. Then I have Ladino 21, which is where I have a partner, and it's more of a team effort, right? But the Hyperpolyglot activist, it's done by me because I think it's a very personal project, and it will be hard for somebody else to really share that perspective in all those forms. People can access it very easily at www.thehyperpolyglotactivist.com. That is hyper, that is polyglot, and activist, right? www.thehyperpolyglotactivist.com. And there on top, you can see the YouTube, the Twitter, and the Facebook links, and you can access them. If you have questions, doubts, you want to follow me, Twitter, I think, is the easiest, but you can also drop me a message on Facebook or on YouTube. And if you want to write a more extended essay to me, you're welcome to do so at contact@thehyperpolyglotactivist.com. And there you can send attachments, links, etc.
Fantastic. So the Hyperpolyglot Activist, the 3 words all together.com. If you want to reach Carlos, thank you so much for sharing your expertise, your time, and your thoughts. It's been very insightful. And before we close, let's just throw out some of these comments that was remaining. We were talking about the different status of people. So Heather says that the example that Carlos gave was a little sad, but yes, indeed, status does play an important role. What's this one? Idea of translanguaging. Yeah, just like myself. Not that I don't accept it. It's just that sometimes I have a difficult time separating it.
Probably truer words were never spoken. Translanguaging is on the receiving end of so much criticism within academia and beyond. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, and one final one. Vera says thank you for this discussion, and I think she says on behalf of everybody who is watching today and us, the hosts, it was very, very interesting, very enriching discussion. Sadly, she had to go. I don't know if she's still there, but bye-bye, Vera. Hope to see you the next session. Oh, and we just got one last one. Thank you for this thought-provoking session from our good friend Yoshito. So thank you to everybody who has chimed in today. It's been a fantastic session. Loads of fun. Loads of branching out as usual. And let me branch out one last time before we close. Let me ask you, Carlos. Is that typewriter behind you the one you used to write your books? Why do you have a typewriter? My goodness.
I found this is an Olympia typewriter with the Hebrew characters, with Merubah characters. So you can only type in Merubah. And it's because I'm at the Hebrew and Jewish Studies department, which is the first time I've been in such departments. I'm taking classes in Yiddish, in modern Hebrew. I'm having a blast here. Yeah.
Incredible. So it is actually used. It's not a decoration. You're actually using it.
I wouldn't go as far. I don't think it's used for current courses, but maybe it was used for one thing. Yeah.
My goodness, I've not seen one of those for quite a while. Any last words, Uta?
Yes, thank you very much for this interview, especially for giving it a twist also in philosophy, sociolinguistics, and also with putting the emphasis on helping or fostering languages that are not so in the spotlight, which is something that I also support every time I can.
No, thank you very much to both of you, excellent hosts. I learned a lot. As Aristotle said, teaching is the highest form of understanding. So when you speak about things that you think you know, you learn many more things, which I did today. So thank you so much.
Thank you for closing this session with your words of wisdom. Thank you, everybody. Once again, we'll be seeing you one last time in 2022 on the 3rd Tuesday of December, which is 18th? I forget. But just remember, 3rd Tuesday of every month, we will be here at 1 p.m. New York, 6 p.m. London, and 7 p.m. Paris. We'll see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Ciao, alla prossima.
Ciao.